Thank you so much, Diane, and thank you for keeping it brief, because a lot of you, there's a lot of familiar faces in this room, and we've had a lot of conversations, and I'd like to think that you've gotten to know me a little bit as well, so it's not as important that I be introduced here today. But I do want to welcome you all for being here, and I'm actually really excited about our keynote speaker today, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But let me talk about why the importance of what we call our speaker series here at Sierra Health Foundation. You know, as Diane said, at Sierra Health over the past 5 years, we have really become focused on health equity as an outcome of our investments, a real focus on the social determinants of health and health equity as a kind of foundational components of what we actually do here at the foundation. And I can recall, 5 years ago when we started having these conversations at our board level, a board member saying to me, Chet, no one knows what you're talking about. This social determinants of health stuff, socioeconomic status. What does all this actually mean? And we had a sense that this was a conversation that was really going to go someplace, that had real currency with folks who have been thinking about public health, many of whom who have done important work are actually in this room with us this morning, right? Who've been leading this charge for a long, long time. And our sense was, and in some ways it was a big bet, was that this was going to become the lexicon and focus for doing great things to make communities healthier in the community. Now, we knew we were not at this alone. I mean, this was not some, psychic phenomenon that we were actually having by ourselves. What we were thinking is that we were listening to what was going on nationally. We were trying to stay in tune with what people in the health field were talking about. And we were watching the emergence of, the Affordable Care Act, its expansion with the Public Health and Prevention Fund, and other things that were really beginning to signal that serious change about how we thought about health in communities, what drove health in the communities was really going to take place. Unnatural causes, right? The weight of America, and other things began to come online, which really has influenced our decisions as well. If you know this foundation, you know that one thing that's really important for us, and it is for two reasons. One, out of just who we are as an institution, but partly because of our modest size, which causes us to be really creative in terms of how we structure partnerships. That we knew this was not a journey we wanted to take alone, should take alone, if we wanted to have real impact. And so part of what we started to think about was, how do you stand up a series of speakers, lessons, forums, symposium, call them what you will, where we can bring our community together and hear from some of the most thoughtful folks around about the importance of this particular dynamic, this particular work as we went forward. What we really wanted to do was a couple of things that are really quite simple. We wanted to be smarter about what was changing, right? We wanted to be better informed about what was happening nationally. And we wanted to be able to have a greater impact in the communities in which we work, right? And we wanted to take as many people, everybody if we could, along on the journey with us. That's what the speaker series really is all about. I also want to say that, if you know about our work, then you know that we've recently opened an office in Merced. And the folks in Merced are joining us today because we are beaming this conversation back to that particular office as well. If you look at the National County Health Rankings that come out of the University of Wisconsin, produced by Robert Wood Johnson, you would see some of the poorest health counties in this country actually follow the 99 state road right down through the Central Valley. If you know the community well, they do define themselves not as the Central Valley, but as the San Joaquin Valley, and on down to the southern parts into the Inland Empire as well. One of the things that we have done in opening that office is to really begin to think about how we could invest in those particular communities as well. We don't see ourselves as saviors. We bring to that our partnership, our thinking, and our relationships, in the hopes that as we grow those partnerships, that they too can engage in this conversation and be better prepared to really improve the health in their communities in the ways that they see fit to do so as well. We think that California only gets healthier as a state if it pays attention to those who are being left behind. And so it's less about San Francisco and Marin and some of the communities where health is doing reasonably well. And this is not a comment suggesting in any way that we don't want them to do better. But we're committed to not having folks be left so far behind that there is no defensible reason for us not thinking about our investments, differently. And that's what we're committed to do. We have a couple of people I want to thank for being here today, and one is a member of our board of directors here, Ms. Nancy Lee. And it's always great. It's always great when you have a board member who can show up because they become a champion for some of the work in signing, can share some of the work that we're actually doing, and actually can take back some of the conversations, questions that you may actually have, and have that be part of what happens at the board. Actually, I'm really blessed that we have an extraordinary board here at Sierra Health. We also have Dr. Ron Chapman, who's director for the California Department of Public Health, who has joined us. Thank you, Dr. Chapman. And we have the Deputy Director, Mr. Jahmal Miller, who's also here, who's going to follow me in his remarks. And let me introduce him right now, as a matter of fact. And I actually have a sheet on Jahmal, but I'm not going to use that. So Jahmal was one of the first individuals I actually met when I came to Sierra Health. We actually had lunch at the cafe right down the road here, and we got into a conversation about the social determinants of health, right? And he found it to be fascinating, and we actually agreed to kind of go on a journey together. And I think Jahmal's looking a little bit for mentorship, but it actually became a partnership because I think we've both been kind of supporting one another in that particular journey. If you know my history, you know that I actually was a social service agency director. We didn't grow up in the world of health. And I really believe that some of the things that I was battling with food stamps and TANF programs and others really need to be informed by this particular work. And Jahmal had a health background, so I always found the conversations to be quite informative, quite provocative, as we were trying to think about how we could work together to advance this particular agenda. Jahmal subsequently went to work for Kaiser. We worked on a national community benefit with a good friend of mine, Dr. Ray Baxter. And then was appointed by the governor to his current position at the California Department of Public Health, where he is the first director of the Office of Health Equity. And I think I love the title, the Office of Health Equity. And things have really got elevated when there is a governor appointee to run an Office of Health Equity. And it's just an extraordinary thing that's really taking place in California. But what I know most about Jahmal is his deep and abiding kind of commitment to this particular work, and his willingness to be a teacher as well as a listener and learner about how to actually move this agenda forward as well. So with that, let me bring to the microphone my good friend and colleague, Jahmal Warner.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just delighted to be here. I was shocked to even be invited to attend, let alone be on the agenda, and especially speaking before who I consider a rock star in this work, Dr. David Williams. So I'm put in a pretty tight spot between Chet and Dr. Williams. But I'm just going to spend a few moments just sharing with you about our Office of Health Equity. I've been in this role for about 8.5 months, and I truly, truly appreciate the support from even prior to day one that I've had in my career from Chet, and particularly when I started the interview process, and that's when I met Dr. Chapman, who's my director. He too is the man as far as his genuine and authentic commitment to health equity and operationalizing health equity throughout the California Department of Public Health. And it makes my job easier with your support, with your leadership in the California Department of Public Health. So I truly appreciate your support and your partnership. Just to do kind of a survey, how many of you prior to this introduction were familiar that we even had an office, or you even had an Office of Health Equity in the state of California. Okay, great. That's better than a few rooms I've been in before. So now I'll ask the question again. How many of you now know that you have an Office of Health Equity? It should be 100%. Okay, branding and messaging is one of our strategic imperatives. So now you know. But just to give you kind of an overview of our Office of Health Equity, many of other states call their offices, and even at the federal level, call their office the Office of Minority Health. And that is an important cohort, if you will, of what we define as vulnerable communities. But that's not the only piece as far as minorities go. It's about low-income people, people who have been incarcerated, who are incarcerated, people who suffer from disabilities, have mental illness, chronic conditions, and a variety of others, people who live in vulnerable places. So the definition per our health and safety code leaves none of us untouched when we think about vulnerable communities. So I, too, am happy about the narrative being shifted away from just disparities and inequities to the Office of Health Equity and putting a more positive and opportunistic label on this important work that it is that we're doing. As far as the organizational structure, as I mentioned, our office is not, buried in the basement of the California Department of Public Health. We are elevated, and as I said, I report directly into the director's office. So we have a prominent role and position to not just work across the 200 some odd programs that we have in the California Department of Public Health to operationalize health equity, but we're well positioned through our Health and All Policies team that has a task force of about 22 departments, offices, and agencies to where we're partnered with them to get them to look through a health equity lens about how is it that the policies, the decisions, the actions that they're undertaking, how is that shaping health and equity across the state of California. So it's those non-traditional health partners, the Department of Social Services, Cal EPA, CU Arsenio, Department of Education, Food and Ag, and many other entities that we have on a regular basis at the table who have partnered alongside with us to carry forth this health equity agenda, Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and many others. Within our office, we also have our Community Development and Engagement Unit, which is leading a first-of-its-kind project in our country that has $60 million dedicated to a mental health disparities project called the California Reducing Disparities Project. And the intent of this funding that comes from the Mental Health Services Act here in the state of California is to invest in community-defined practices around mental health that are considered more culturally and linguistically appropriate. We're targeting 5 particular communities: the LGBTQ, African American, Native American, API, and the Latino communities. And our goal with investing over the next 4 years, $60 million, is to not only demonstrate their effectiveness, but to support that through rigorous evaluation. So it's well documented, and we can transition this work that is working well on the ground from being just culturally and linguistically appropriate, but also recognized as evidence-based and potentially reimbursable. And we're really delighted about the opportunity and the prospect of that program. Also in our office, have a climate and health team that's focused on climate change and a variety of other issues. I have a data unit, and we have over 20 staff in the office. And that is in and of itself a blessing, because if you look at Nevada, for instance, that also has an Office of Minority Health, they have 2 people to do that work for the state. So we are well positioned and poised to do some great work. We've worked closely with our advisory committee, where we've toiled in this room over the last few months to come up with a strategic plan for the state of California that is not limited to just what the Office of Health Equity can do, but it's all about what we can do from a cross-sectoral and comprehensive standpoint with partners through collaboration and partnerships here in the state of California. So as a team, we have a very strong team, a strong unit based in a department with strong leadership, and we have support from our governor to advance this very, very important work. As I wrap up, I'm going to let, like I said, the rock star do what he does here shortly. And I was thinking last night, in addition to giving you just the organizational structure and the direction that we have as an office to to work on policies, programs, and efforts that address disparities and inequities here in the state of California. I wanted to just leave this concept, which kind of deviates from the traditional 3 C's that Chet and I often talk about. Courage is one of them, and I'll get back to that. But I wanted to leave the 3 C's with you all and letting you know that these 3 C's are kind of governing the direction of the Office of Health Equity as I have been given this opportunity to lead. One of the C's is our children. When we think about the need to have a strong foundation upon which our children and families in California can establish and build upon. I was excited this morning. I don't know, it's like 5:58. Yeah, I remember it was 5:58 this morning. Picked up my phone and went to CNN, and there was an interview on there with our president talking about this summit, this Children and Family Summit that's going to be coming up this week. And he highlighted the importance of people having affordable child care, of families having the opportunity to have access to a livable wage, of our children being able to have just the best and the brightest of futures. And that is one of the critical, as you'll hear about, social determinants of health when we talk about childhood development, when we talk about educational attainment, and many of these policies and decisions that are made that we often think have nothing to do with health and or health equity, but have everything to do with health and or health equity. And I'm motivated by that. So our children, for me, are vital. And it's so good to see that our president is taking on this leadership effort to navigate our direction in achieving health equity in this country. The second C is collective impact. As I mentioned before, cross-sectoral and comprehensively, we need to work together. We are a country that has more money and resources than we know what to do with. And demonstrated by the 18% or so that we invest in our health care, where we have some of the worst and most persistent disparities that you'll see, whether it's infant mortality and others. So it's not a money issue. And what we're finding is that this need for a collective impact, for us to literally bust silos and to work collaboratively across public and private nonprofit entities, there's a real need for that. So we've got to become more efficient and effective on this journey towards achieving health equity, and collective impact is so critical. And that's why I'm inspired today. As I look across the room, we see that array of people from all sectors, from all walks of life, who are coming together. Some of us, we do need resources to do this work, but at the end of the day, we've got to bust those silos, because whether you're Kaiser Permanente, that's a $50 billion entity that still has issues with disparities, or you're that struggling community-based organization that's trying to achieve health equity as well, the only way we can do it is to come together and be more efficient and effective about this work. And the last C, it is very cliche and it's pulling at our heartstrings, but it's really having the courage. When you have 25% of children in our state who are living in poverty, when you have 1 in 3 children in our state who are food insecure, when every day, when you look at the great work that our border health team does, that division in California Department of Public Health, to where every day people are dying literally on our borders, coming from Mexico to California for better opportunity, and a variety of issues around educational attainment, dropout rates. I mean, we see some very real opportunities when we look at the disheartening data, but it's going to take courage and political will, and sometimes finding that courage is difficult, So I want to be one of those people who has the courage. And I know that I need partners like you in the Office of Health Equity for us to step up, to do the right thing. And it's not going to take more money per se. It's not going to take more of a lot of things that we're trying to do. I mean, we have the best of technology, but we don't have the courage to stand up and do the right thing to achieve health equity, then this battle is for naught. And I'm not a believer that this battle is for naught. So I'm excited and thankful for this opportunity, and hopefully I was able to tee it up a little bit more for what Dr. Williams is going to share. And it's just an honor. Once again, I've only seen him on YouTube and in other settings, but to be able to listen and to learn It's kind of like a revival moment to be able to listen to this health equity evangelist, if you will. So with that said, thank you so much for this opportunity to share. Everyone knows about the Office of Health Equity. It's your office. It's your Office of Health Equity. So if you want to come hang out with me, I have an open door policy. I want to share the strategic plan with you and figure out a way that your organization can plug into our ability to achieve health equity in the state of California. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jahmal. This is further evidence why we're so hopeful, because we have extraordinary leadership coming out of the state, and Dr. Chapman, and of course, Jahmal as well. We also have Arsenio Matacos here from Cal EPA. We want to recognize Arsenio. And, it's interesting because this is Cal EPA, right? Environmental protection. They just released a series of maps about 4 weeks ago around health disparities in California that had kind of an environmental but also a physical health lens associated with it, things like clean drinking water and others as well. So Arsenio has also been someone I've had a great opportunity to meet with and talk about what's going on in the San Joaquin Valley. He is a son of the San Joaquin Valley, and it's another great partner that we've been working with as well. So welcome, Arsenio. And I'd like to introduce the rock star, David R. Williams. It's interesting, I was talking with Dr. Williams today, and I said, I've read some of your research, and said, I first heard of you at the University of Michigan. He said, you know, there were like 3 other David Williams, DR, at the University of Michigan. And I had to stop and think. I said, well, I wonder whose research I was really reading there. But I think we kind of got it clarified that it was the research that he had been producing. But let me read, you have his bio. I'm going to say a couple of things and read some of the highlights. He's a Florence and Laura Norman Professor of Public Health at Harvard School of Public Health and Professor of African and African American Studies and of Sociology at Harvard University. His prior academic appointments were at Yale University and University of Michigan, and he holds a Master's in Public Health from Loma Linda University and a PhD in Sociology from the University of Michigan. He is an internationally recognized authority on social influences on health. His research has enhanced our understanding of the complex ways in which socioeconomic status, race, stress, racial discrimination, and religious involvement can affect one's health. He is the author of more than 325 scholarly papers and has served on editorial boards of 12 scientific journals and as reviewer for over 60 other journals as well. He's ranked as one of the 10 most cited researchers in the social sciences during the decade of 1995 to 2005. He's also elected member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as well. He has also played a visible national leadership role in raising awareness levels of the problems of health disparities and identifying interventions to address them. And most recently, he served as staff director for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Commission on a Healthier America, something that at this foundation we're quite familiar with as well. Extraordinary resume, and I didn't even read it all. Bio, I didn't even read it all. I will say on a personal level that I was first introduced to his work many years ago when I was working at the Rockefeller Foundation in New York, and we had a project that was called California Works for Better Health with the California Endowment. Was really trying to figure out what impact did unemployment and in some cases employment have on one's health status. There's been a lot of stuff from the Whitehall studies and others that have looked at this particular issue over many, many years. This is one of the first foundation interventions that were being designed as a program to try to address that particular issue. A lot of reading, a lot of research. Led the Rockefeller team with Marion Standish, who led the California Endowment team, and had a friend who had graduated from the University of Michigan, who's now a professor at Columbia, who said, there's a doctor at University of Michigan, David Williams, you gotta read some of his stuff. And so we pulled that into our kind of reconnaissance work. And we found it extraordinary. And though we never contacted him directly, it really influenced what we ultimately produced. In my first conversation with Jahmal, we talked about the stress of what does it mean to be an African-American male who achieves some level of success, and with that isolation, what it really does to one's health status. Because actually it's one of the few groups where even as you move up the ladder, your health status actually doesn't move as quickly as others, and at some levels actually begins to decline. I remember having that conversation, and it was really built off the research that I had read all those years ago that Dr. Williams had actually produced. More than anything else, I would say that it has not only affected my thinking as a person who's admittedly comes out of social services, but also around my behavior in my own life and the life of my two sons as we move forward. And while Dr. Williams' research has influenced large institutions across the globe in their particular thinking, I think it's always good to know that it impacts individuals at an individual level in communities as a way of showing what its true power really is. Right? It gives you the ability to interact in ways that improves your own health at a very individual level. We are extraordinarily excited and honored to have him join us here today as we begin our journey to address health disparities in California with our focus on the San Joaquin Valley. And the folks who are in Merced, welcome to this particular conversation. It's a great honor that I bring to the podium Dr. David Williams, the researcher I did read many years ago.
Good morning, and it's really good for me to be here with you today. I have truly been sitting back and enjoying Chet and Jahmal, and they could continue for a while because they are certainly inspiring me with what they're doing, and that's really a good sign that they are leaders here in this state and that all of you would devote time out of your busy schedules, in fact, to be here and join us today. If I can remember what I need to do here, I think I'll be okay. Okay, I think we're all set. So what I want to do today, and want to leave plenty of time for discussion, so I'm going to just jump right in to my talk. And I really want to lay out some of the contours of the challenges that we face as we think of health in the United States. One of the intriguing things that I encounter when you deal with many policymakers is that many don't know about the extent and depth of disparities. And then when they understand it, the next reaction is this is so overwhelming and so complex that there's nothing we can do about it. So that's a myth. We actually know what needs to be done. We know that it actually works. We know it will save us money. So the question is, where do we find the courage and the political will to do better? So making America healthier for all, challenges and opportunities. So I want to begin with some of the big challenges we face in the United States in terms of health. The first big disparity that we seldom talk about as much as we should is that we are not the healthiest people in the world. And we should be, because we spend more money on medical care than any other country in the world. More money, absolutely more money per person. In fact, according to the World Bank, half of the money spent on medical care in the world annually is spent in the United States. We are less than 6% of the world's population, consume 1/2 of its medical resources, and rank near the bottom of the industrialized world on health, and we are losing ground over time. So, for example, if you look at life expectancy, in 1980, we ranked 11th in the world. In 2006, we ranked 33rd in the world, behind countries like Cyprus, the United Arab Emirates, South Korea, Costa Rica, and Portugal, are countries that have longer life expectancy than the United States. And I'll be talking about racial, ethnic inequalities in health. It's not just that the minorities are doing badly. In 2006, if white America were a country, it would rank 30th in the world on life expectancy. 29 countries doing better than the white population of the United States. If black America were a country, it would rank 58th in the world. So again, we need to begin this conversation by recognizing the huge shortfalls by race, ethnicity, place, socioeconomic status that need to be addressed. But first of all of us are far less healthy than we could or should be. And to bring that point home, in the first iteration of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Commission to Build a Healthy America, we really wanted to make that point home. We need to understand the socioeconomic and racial disparities in health in the context that all of us need to be taking action to improve our health. And what we did was we created state-by-state chart books on adult health and child health. And you can still find them. I pulled this PowerPoint down this morning from the RWJ Commission website, and you can look at every state with multiple indicators of adult and child health. And I picked the state of California, and what's here is infant mortality by education, and you can see women with a college degree or more education have the lowest rate of infant mortality for any other education group. And here's a variation by race, and you can see the towering excess risk for African Americans in terms of infant mortality. But what is also evident here in this chart book, we show where the US ranks overall and where the state of California is overall. But most importantly, we created a national benchmark. And the national benchmark wasn't a number from out of thin air. It was a real number of a group of women are doing right now in terms of infant mortality. In this case, it's the infant mortality rate among the college educated in the state that has the lowest stable rate of infant mortality. So it's a stable rate of infant mortality among a real group of American women today. There is no biological reason why all Americans are not at this 3.2 number, because that's the real number that real women in this country are having today. And if you use that as the real number, everybody in the state of California, every racial ethnic group, every socioeconomic status, even white women, even college-educated women in the state of California are not achieving the national benchmark. And don't feel bad, that's true in 49 other states, given the way we defined it. But it really brings home the point that it's about all of us. It's not just about their problems, it's about our problems. And as a nation, we need to do better in terms of health. And in the United States, there are large variations in health by geography. That has already been highlighted already, from one zip code to another, from one county to another, even from one train stop to another. And one of the things we did was we created maps to illustrate that, and this one went over well when we did congressional briefings. It's a map of the DC subway system that shows how health varies by where you board a train on the red line. And if you board a train at one end of the red line, you live 7 years longer than those who board a train at the other end of the red line. So even in very small geographic spaces, you can find large variations in health. Let me give you another example, and I'm borrowing this from David Fleming, the Director of Public Health from Seattle and King County in the state of Washington. He looked at the best performing data on the best performing countries in the world on life expectancy. And then he compared that to the life expectancy of his county, King County, home of Seattle and Starbucks and other great American corporations. Now, the state of Washington does very well on health if you compare it to other states. And Seattle, King County does very well on health compared to other states. But that good profile for the county overall hides dramatic variation in health within the county. So what he did was he broke down life expectancy by census tract within the county. And he found that some census tracts in King County were 40 years ahead of the best performing countries in the world on average life expectancy. And other census tracts in the same county, just a bike ride away, were 60 years behind the best performing countries in the world on life expectancy. So within this county, you had a 100-year variation in health just by link to where people lived. And that makes an important point about the importance of local data and how sometimes aggregate data can hide really important pockets of need in a geographic region. And then there are large variations in health by socioeconomic status. I'm a sociologist by training, and I learned in sociology that virtually every desirable resource in society is distributed by socioeconomic status. And here is one that is not as far removed from health as you might think: SAT scores by family income. This is data from ETS in Princeton, New Jersey, showing that as family income increases, this is the old SAT scores, but the same is true, as family income increases, SAT scores increase. It's a graded relationship. The higher the family income, the higher the average SAT scores. That has enormous implications for how we use these tests and what they mean and what they shouldn't mean, but maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. The point is, here is an example of a desirable resource that is dramatically distributed in society by socioeconomic status. And in the United States, life in America isn't just better on the top, it's also healthier and longer. And I usually have to remind audiences that's not Mitt Romney and his family. One example of that, and in the US, we don't report much data by socioeconomic status. We routinely report data by race, but seldom by socioeconomic status. Here's an example of data for the US, national data, on the risk of premature death. And premature death is defined here as death before the age of 65. So what are the chances of someone dying before the age of 65 by income level? And you can see here's the relative risk. So low-income Americans 3 times more likely to die before the age of 65 compared to high-income Americans. And the data reflects what we call a threshold effect. It's not a gradient effect. It's not a threshold effect. It's not that once you get above a certain level of income, income doesn't matter. But every higher level of family income is associated, in this case, with a lower risk of death. Why does socioeconomic status matter so much? The World Health Organization points out that socioeconomic status shapes your opportunities to be healthy from the cradle to the grave. It affects your access to education, quality education, and opportunities to be healthy in childhood and adolescence. It affects the quality of employment opportunities. It affects the quality of housing and neighborhood environments. It affects your ability to raise your family and affects even the quality of life in retirement. So from the cradle to the grave, socioeconomic status shapes your opportunities to be healthy. And in the United States, socioeconomic status and race are very tightly intertwined. Here is data on median household income and race from a 2012 census report. But let me break that down in a way that you really can understand it. Same data. For every dollar of income that white households have, Asian households have $1.26. So they actually have slightly higher household income. That must be kept in mind. You have to understand that data that Asian households on average have more persons contributing to the household income. So that if we actually looked at per capita income, whites have the highest per capita income in the United States. And this is not a point that you probably are well aware of as well, that all of these racial ethnic groups that I'll talk about have considerable diversity and mass real populations of vulnerability within them. So even though the Asian households have the highest levels of total household income, there's subgroups within the Asian category, like the Hmong, the Laotian, and the Cambodian, that have higher rates of poverty than African Americans or American Indians. So that's an important point. But for every dollar of wealth that white households have, white households have, you can see Latino households having 73 cents and African American households having 63 cents. And that's 2009 data, not 1969 data. So these disparities in income really still exist today. But the disparities in income don't tell the full story. Income is only one indicator of household economic resources. More powerful than income is wealth. Wealth are the economic reserves that a household has that can cushion shortfalls of income. And the racial differences in wealth are much, much larger than the racial differences in income. And the racial differences in wealth have become wider over time. They were better in 2000 than they are now in these 2007 data. Again, let me put the data in a way that you can readily understand. For every dollar of wealth that whites have, blacks and Latinos have only 6 cents. That's the racial differences in wealth, which explains why minority households are so close to being homeless. Because if you have no wealth, no economic reserves, you're one paycheck away from being homeless. And if we exclude home equity, which is a major source of wealth for American households, for every dollar of wealth whites have, black and Latino households have 1 penny. That's the magnitude of the racial inequality in wealth in the United States. And just that you know, there are researchers who've studied this. There are no racial ethnic differences in savings behavior at equivalent levels of income. So this does not reflect the fact that minorities are not saving. There are no racial ethnic differences in savings behavior at equivalent levels of income. What it reflects is primarily 2 factors. One, racial differences in what scholars call the intergenerational transfers of wealth. A fancy term that means that when relatives die, whites are more likely to inherit income, and blacks and Latinos more likely to have to pay the funeral expenses for the relative who died. It's the truth. The second reason has to do with racial differences in home equity over time. There are higher rates of home ownership in the white population and the African American and Latino population. The period of time which led to the massive development of suburban communities and the highway system and home ownership on a large scale in the United States through federal policy in the post-World War II period explicitly excluded African Americans from participating. And other minorities from participating in that development. So they still have lower rates of home ownership, one, linked to that historic moment. But secondly, if an African-American family buys a home in an African-American neighborhood, and a white family buys a home of an equivalent price in a white neighborhood, 10 years later, the white home will be worth more, will have greater home equity than African-American home. Why? The law of supply and demand. There is more demand for homes in white neighborhoods than in predominantly minority neighborhoods, and demand drives value and drives the worth of the home, so there are greater gains in home equity over time of homes. So those are the factors that drive the racial differences in wealth. So given this strong relationship between race and socioeconomic status, it's not surprising that there are large racial ethnic differences in wealth. And if we look at race, ethnicity, and wealth and health in the United States, there are two main patterns that emerge. They're the patterns for those population groups that have been in the United States for a long time, characterized by what I call economic exploitation, social stigmatization, and geographic marginalization. I'm talking about Native American communities, I'm talking about Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities, and I'm talking about blacks or African Americans. They have much worse health than the US average. And then there are immigrant groups that tend to have better health than the US average, and clearly better health than the native-born initially, but experiences worsening health over time. And that's the pattern for Asians and Latinos. So for example, if we look at national data for the US, overall mortality, infant mortality rates for the whole country, immigrants of all racial ethnic groups have better health than their native-born counterparts. White immigrants have better health than whites born in the US. Black immigrants have better health than blacks born in the US. Asian immigrants have better health than Asians born in the US. Latino immigrants have better health than Latinos born in the US. Across the board, we find this healthy immigrant effect. It's almost as if the data is saying there's something about the American way of life that's dangerous to your health. Because what happens with increasing length of stay and generational status, the health of immigrants declines. And I'm going to show you two quick examples of this and how dramatic these declines are. This is national data for the United States looking at the prevalence of DSM-4 defined psychiatric disorders. So this is the prevalence of mental disorders, not just depressive symptoms, but defined mental disorders from national studies funded by NIMH, looking at three immigrant groups: Caribbean black immigrants, Latino immigrants, and Asian immigrants. These data, by the way, reflect persons living in the community. It's not treatment data. It's not biased by persons who got treatment. So it's looking at persons in treatment and not in treatment. What you find, this is first generation, by the way, the average for the US is around 35%. 33 to 35% is where the US average is of lifetime risk of mental disorders. By the way, there's an important point here. I do work on mental health too. In fact, the Caribbean data is work I did. The important point is mental health problems is not some isolated fringe problem in America. It's a very common problem that occurs among many people. But you see the Caribbean first generation, these are immigrants to the US, much lower than the US average. By the second generation, that means these kids were born in the US, their parents were immigrants, they are at the US average. Third generation, the single most high-risk group we have seen in US data, 55% of Caribbean immigrants, third generation, meet criteria for defined DSM-4 psychiatric disorder. And you see for Latinos, the same thing, first to second to third. Again, the third generation also much worse than the US average. For Asians, we see a jump from the first to the second generation, but not a big jump to the third. And I think what's happening with the Asian population is the higher levels of socioeconomic status is cushioning this worsening health. So you see an initial decline in health, but it kind of stabilizes over time. But for the Caribbean black population and the Latino population, you see this dramatic worsening in health in the United States. And someone says that's mental health data, don't trust self-report, all kinds of problems with the data. So let me show you some other data. This is from the NHANES study, using a measure that Arlene Geronimus and colleagues calls allostatic load out of Bruce McEwen's work and Teresa Siemens' work, using 10 measured indicators of physiological functioning, like blood pressure, BMI, glycated hemoglobin, albumin, creatinine, clearance, triglycerides, 3 reactive protein, okay, 10 markers of physiological functioning. And let's see what happens to Mexican immigrants in the United States. So here, let's just look at the blue color, which is persons 45 to 60 in the interest of time. This is US-born persons. So here is the mean level of allostatic load for whites in the US. And you see for African Americans, it's significantly higher. For US-born Mexicans, this 4.6 is slightly lower than African Americans, but it's not statistically different. Okay, so you see US-born Mexicans here. But let's look at foreign-born Mexicans. These are immigrants, 0 to 10 years in the US. So they've just arrived in the US. Their level of allostatic load is similar to that of whites. By 21 years in the US, their level of allostatic load is not statistically significant from that of African Americans and foreign-born Latinos. We have seen that same data. I've been doing work in a study called the Chicago Community Adult Health Study, probability sample of the city of Chicago, about 1/3 black, 1/3 Latino, 1/3 African American. On every health outcome we have looked at, if we look at blacks, whites, Latinos, whites do best, African Americans do worse, Latinos are intermediate. But in everything we have looked at so far, if we separate Latinos simply by nativity status, where were you born? US-born Latinos look like African Americans on levels of health, on levels of stress, on levels of sleep problems. Foreign-born Latinos look like whites on the same indicators. So we've seen this dramatic worsening of health in one generation for the Latino population, which says really important, especially in the state of California. You need to analyze data by nativity, because if you don't, you might obscure some really pockets of need that are emerging in our data. And really an important public health challenge that we face is what interventions, if any, can we implement that would reverse this downward trajectory of health for immigrants with increasing length of stay in the United States. And I think we tend to think of this for the Latino immigrants, but I'm suggesting that it's a much broader phenomenon where we have data in terms of other groups as well. So in terms of racial ethnic disparities in health, there are also significant challenges we need to understand. We need to understand what researchers like Arlene Geronimus and others call accelerated aging, premature aging, or weathering. The fact that not only do minorities have higher rates of illness, but they get sick at markedly younger ages, and there's more rapid decline in their physiological functioning over time. There are racial ethnic differences not only in the onset of the disease, but in the severity and progression of disease. There's a persistence of a residual effect of race. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The role of elevated exposure to psychosocial stressors and the role of institutional racism. And the fact that health is affected not only by current socioeconomic status, but what by people have experienced over their life course. And taking a life course perspective is really important. And I think I completely endorse the remarks that were made earlier about the importance of looking at early childhood. And we clearly now know today, the scientific evidence is very clear that health, the foundations of health in adulthood are laid in childhood. And there's some work that came out just about a month ago from the Abecedarian study in North Carolina. It's a study that looked at what impact you would have if birth through 5, you provided an enhanced early childhood development opportunity for kids. And they've now linked They've followed them over time, randomized controlled trial, have a control group, have an intervention group, and they've now followed them into their 30s. And into their mid-30s, they have taken like a kind of an allostatic load battery, look at the metabolic and cardiovascular functioning. And what they find, that those kids who got an enhanced early childhood of good nutrition, of access to medical care, of intellectually stimulating activities. At age 35, not only are they doing better academically, we had a study done at age 20. We found at age 20, they had lower rates of depressive symptoms. They were less likely to smoke cigarettes. But at age 35, on risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease, they are better off. On risk of obesity, outcomes, their measures of weight, BMI at 0 to 5 predicts BMI at age 35. And so it's a dramatic illustration of the power of early childhood to have a huge impact on health. And in the United States, we are faced with this challenge of these disparities are so persistent. Here is life expectancy data for blacks and whites, the only two groups for which we have data going back that far, 1950 to 2006. And there's good news in these data. The good news is there was about an 8-year gap in life expectancy in 1950, and in 2006 there's a 5-year gap. Now, a 5-year gap in life expectancy is still large. If we were to freeze the life expectancy of whites and have the life expectancy of blacks increase at a rate at which average life expectancy has increased in the last 10 years, it would take 35 years for African Americans to close the gap in life expectancy. And you can see that number in the table. Look at the life expectancy of whites in 1950, 69.1 years. And let's ask, how long did it take for African Americans to reach the health that whites had in 1950? You would see it was 1990, 40 years later. That's when, so you look, huge gaps in health in two groups living in the same society. When I started my career a long time ago, most researchers felt that these racial ethnic disparities in health were driven simply by socioeconomic status, differences in income and education, occupational status. We now know life is a little more complicated than that. And let me illustrate that with national data for the United States. Life expectancy at age 25. At age 25, the average white person will live 5 years longer than the average African American. So there's a 5-year gap in life expectancy. Importantly, if we look within the white population, there's a 6.4-year gap in life expectancy between whites who have not finished high school and whites with a college degree. A really, really important take-home point. On most indicators of health, the gaps in health by socioeconomic status are actually larger than the gaps in health by race. Why, as a society, we only report routinely racial data? I mean, there are good reasons why, I understand them, but it's kind of doesn't make sense. And you can see within African Americans the same thing, a 5.3-year gap, which is bigger than the black-white gap. And some researchers have said, okay, let's abandon collecting data by race and just look by socioeconomic status because the data is larger. The gaps are larger by socioeconomic status. Not so fast. We really have to look at them both together because we see a more complex story. At every level of education, the same is true for income. I'm only showing you the education data in the interest of time. White high school dropouts still live 3.1 years longer than black high school dropouts. And that gap widens as education increases. Ken Ferraro from Purdue University says that African Americans, middle-class African Americans, suffer from the law of diminishing returns. Yes, they gain from increasing socioeconomic status, but not as much as whites gain. And so we find this striking pattern of the gap in life expectancy is larger among college-educated black and whites than among black and whites who have not finished high school. And just to show you this is not an aberration, here is national data for the United States. Infant mortality by mother's education, less than 12 years to 16 years, and you see the towering excess risk for African American women. Black women with a college degree or more education have the lowest rate of infant mortality among African American women in the US. But the absolute gap actually widens. The relative gap is wider here. And you can see that African American women have a rate of infant mortality, college educated, that is almost 3 times as high as women of other racial ethnic groups. And more stunningly, the most advantaged group of black women have a rate of infant mortality that is higher than women of other racial ethnic groups except Native American women who are high school dropouts. So the best off black women do more poorly than the worst off women of other racial ethnic groups, suggesting that in addition to socioeconomic status, there are other things powerful about race that shapes these outcomes. And just to give you another example of the same phenomenon, a study of all black physicians graduating from Meharry Medical School and all white physicians graduating from Johns Hopkins about the same time. They're all medical doctors practicing in the United States you've explicitly controlled in social class, right? They're all medical doctors trained about the same time, all physicians in the US. But 23 to 25 years later, the black physicians have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, earlier onset of disease, incidence rates of diabetes and hypertension that are twice as high, not 20% higher, but twice as high, higher incidence of coronary artery disease, higher case fatality, which means once they got sick, much more likely to die. All physicians in the United States working at the same time. And so we're left with this puzzle that I've been working on for the last 20 years. Why does race still matter so much? And we now know that there are 4 factors, and there's scientific evidence in support of all of them. Each of these factors makes a contribution. Health is affected not only by your current economic status, but by exposure to adversity over the life course. So let's go back to the college-educated African-American women. Yes, they're college-educated today, and we're comparing them to college-educated white women. But they're much more likely than their white counterparts to be first-generation college-educated, to have been born low birth weight, to have experienced poverty in early childhood, to have experienced deficits in access to medical care and in nutrition in early childhood. And our bodies keep a record of what our exposure has been over the life course. Secondly, all indicators of socioeconomic status are not equivalent across race. What we mean by that is national data says that compared to whites, blacks and Hispanics receive less income at the same levels of education, have less wealth at equivalent levels of income, have less purchasing power. And the purchasing power differences is a dramatic example of where life is not fair. Because the places where blacks and Latinos live are much worse, at least less desirable places to live. But the cost of goods and services are higher in those places. Price per square foot of rental per square foot for an apartment is higher in disadvantaged neighborhoods than in lovely suburban neighborhoods. The cost of food, the cost of insurance is all higher. So they have higher costs. That's what economists mean. The purchasing power, dollar does not stretch as far in their hands. And then personal experiences of discrimination, institutional racism also play a role. I'll give you some quick examples of that. And then minorities also experience high exposure to multiple stressors. And we sometimes don't think about that. We look at the levels of crime and violence in neighborhoods. You know what that means? That means that people are dealing with higher levels of grief, higher levels of loss of loved ones, higher levels of loss of supportive others in their neighborhood children while they're growing up. It's higher levels of stress in so many dimensions. So there's a huge body of research on racism and the multiple ways in which racism can affect health. In the interest of time today, I'm only going to touch base briefly on 2 of them to give you a feel for the kinds of evidence, but I do have papers that describe all of the mechanisms. Now, I teach undergraduate students, have done that for the last 25 years at Yale, at Michigan, and now at Harvard. And my students are all very idealistic, know that racism existed in the past, and they think Martin Luther King, civil rights movement, racism no longer exists. So I try to find evidence for them, documenting the discrimination. There's really good scientific evidence on the persistence of discrimination in the United States. And the best evidence comes from what are called audit studies. In an audit study, you hold everything identical except that you vary race. And I'll give you examples of Deva Pager, a sociologist, was at Princeton, recently moved to Harvard's work. This is her doctoral dissertation at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She sent 2 African-American males and 2 white males with identical resumes to apply for entry-level jobs in Milwaukee. She threw a wrinkle into the study. She had one of the black males, one of the white males say on his resume he was out on parole, had served an 18-month prison sentence for cocaine possession. So one of the whites and one of the blacks had a criminal record. Well, she found what we would expect to find, that whether you were black or white, if you had a criminal record, this is a callback rate for the application for the white male with a criminal record, much lower than for the white male with no criminal record, and you can see the same. The African-American male with a criminal record was less likely to get a callback for a job than the African-American male without one. But she also found what we did not expect to find. It was easier for a white male with a criminal record to get a callback for a job than a black male whose record was clean. The resumes were identical. And she repeated a study in New York City looking blacks, whites, and Latinos, and also found that the white felon had a higher callback rate than the Latino or African-American felon, Latino or African-American applicant with a clean record in the face of identical resumes. And this was a 2004 study, not a 1964 study. So it's dramatic evidence of the persistence of discrimination. And there's evidence that I could talk to you for 1 hour on studies that document the persistence of discrimination in the price being offered a car, in bail being set in the United States, in housing, in education, in employment opportunities. There's very striking evidence from multiple contexts showing these experiences. So this kind of discrimination, by the way, to make you feel a little better, it's not only Americans discriminate. There are studies I've found from Western Europe, from Australia, from New Zealand, documenting similar patterns of discrimination with persons with Arabic last names or resumes with Arabic last names. They document similar kinds of discrimination. So it's a deeply human phenomenon that we are talking about. Now, for some experiences of discrimination that people have, they are aware of. And one of the things I have been studying is what's the impact of the stress of discrimination, of experience of discrimination. I developed a scale that captures the major experience of discrimination, being unfairly didn't receive a promotion or not hired for a job or discouraged by a teacher from pursuing education or being stopped, physically threatened, or abused by the police. Those are the big things. But I also was inspired by the work of Philomena Essert. She's a Dutch scholar, and the work of Joe Fagan, an American sociologist. They've been doing qualitative research, talking to people who've actually experienced discrimination. Philomena Essert studying Dutch immigrants from the Caribbean in the Netherlands, as well as African-American women in California, and Joe Fagan studying African-Americans in the US. And one of the things Philomena Essert said is that discrimination is not just in those big things. It's also in the day-to-day little things. And so I developed a scale that is now the most widely used scale in studies of discrimination and health, which have also completely exploded around the world, that try to capture the day-to-day little things, that ask questions like, in your day-to-day life, how often are you treated with less courtesy than others? How often are you treated with less respect than others? How often you receive poorer service than others in restaurants or stores? How often do people act as if they think you are not smart? How often do people act as if they are afraid of you? How often do people act as if they're better than you are? And this happens all the time. It happened to me yesterday. Before I boarded my flight, I went to the supermarket, bought some items in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, and I bought 2 cases of water. And to my checker, I pointed out, as I am coming through the line, do I need to lift these up? I had 2 cases of water. And she said, no, fine. She rang them up. The checker in the other line saw this black male coming out of the line with the 2 cases of water before the other goods was, and she shouted over to the other one, did you notice he has water in the case? And it's, what was the need for this? Okay, just to point that this is not just academic. You know, my blood pressure went up a little bit at that point in time. No, but this is really real. Dr. Tenny Lewis from Yale University has used my scale, and just to illustrate, I just pick on her work because it's an example of what we have learned about the impact of these little indignities on a day-to-day basis. Every line on this slide represents a different study. She finds that persons who score high in everyday discrimination have high level of coronary artery calcification. That's measuring at a subclinical level the development of heart disease in your arteries. High levels of C-reactive protein, a mark of inflammation. High levels of blood pressure. higher levels of low birth weight among pregnant women who report everyday discrimination. Not affects only the women, it affects the next generation. Higher levels of cognitive impairment in the study of the elderly followed over time. Poorer sleep, both objectively and subjectively assessed in a sample of the elderly followed over time. Everyday discrimination predicts mortality. They die faster. And in one of the most fascinating studies, we have enormous interest in obesity and in abdominal obesity, and we now know that while abdominal fat is bad for you, we know abdominal fat can be categorized into two types. There's a subcutaneous fat, the fat on the surface of your body, right under your skin, and then there's the visceral fat, the deeper fat within your organs, between your organs. And what we know that's really bad, a type of abdominal fat that is bad, is the visceral fat, it's the deep fat. And in this study, they use imaging data to separate the subcutaneous fat from the visceral fat. And everyday discrimination is unrelated to waist circumference, unrelated to waist-hip ratio, unrelated to subcutaneous fat, predicts higher levels of visceral fat, exactly the type of fat that's bad. Intriguingly, in this study, and in some of Tenny Lewis's work, she finds that although African-American women report higher levels of discrimination than white women also report discrimination, and the effects are uniform across race. So white women who report everyday discrimination also have high levels of visceral fat, just like African-American women, but African-American women report discrimination at a higher level than white women do. So we now know that discrimination is actually, by the way, there are studies from the United States, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand that have documented that these experiences of discrimination make an incremental contribution in statistical models after we've statistically adjusted for income and education, and we add discrimination. Discrimination helps to explain the residual effect of race that remains after we took income and education into account. So we now know empirically that discrimination is part of the reason, the subjective experience of discrimination, why there are racial disparities in health over and above income and education. Now, quickly, I need to move along here really quickly. Place matters a lot. Residential segregation has been a driver of the place differences in health in the United States, and there are wonderful reports that tout the decline in levels of segregation in the United States, and they're true. Levels are going down. For example, index of dissimilarity declined from 0.70 in 90 to 0.66 in 2000. That means in 1990, 70% of blacks would have to move to have an even distribution of blacks and whites, and in 1990 it was 66. The point is, scholars who study segregation use a score of 60 or higher as hypersegregation. So even though it's going down, it's still at a hypersegregation rate. More importantly, the decline in segregation has had no impact on the very high percentage black census tracts, the residential isolation of most African Americans, and the concentration of urban poverty. I wrote a paper in 2001 in which I argued that residential segregation was a fundamental cause of racial disparities in health, and we are kidding ourselves if we think we are addressing racial disparities in health if we don't address the fundamental forces that segregation drives. And I'm not unique in saying that. Myrtle said it in 1944, that segregation was basic to understanding racial inequality. John Sell is a historian at Duke University. Actually, he died recently, British historian at Duke. He wrote a book on the origins of segregation in the U.S. South and South Africa entitled The Highest Stage of White Supremacy. And he argued that residential segregation by race was one of the single most successful domestic policies of the 20th century in the United States. Because it's beneath the radar screen. No policymakers are talking about it right now, but it has pervasive adverse negative effects on health. What are some of the effects on health? What does segregation have to do with health? Well, where you live determines access to education and employment opportunities. Where you live determines the quality of neighborhood and housing environments. Where you live determines whether it's easy or difficult to live a healthy lifestyle. Where you live also affects your access to high-quality medical care. This is David Cutler, Dean of the Social Sciences at Harvard University, one of the country's most respected economists, did a study looking at a cohort of African Americans and whites in the United States using fancy econometric models that I cannot even fully describe. But he is able to identify that if you isolated segregation and eliminated segregation, you would completely erase black-white differences in income, education, and unemployment, and reduce black-white differences on single motherhoods by 2/3. All of that driven by segregation. So if you want a magic bullet, we now know what it is that we need to address to really have a dramatic impact on outcomes. Give you an example of the power of segregation. This is from the Wall Street Journal, analysis of the EEOC reports of 35,000 companies, looked at the economic downturn in 1991. African Americans were the only racial group to experience a net loss of jobs. Other groups had a net gain of jobs during this economic downturn. Importantly, none of the loss of jobs reflected an employer looking across the room at an African American worker and discriminating against him. In fact, it reflected normal corporate downsizing, restructuring and downsizing. But they all reflected companies moving jobs from areas where African Americans were concentrated. So, for example, give you two examples. Sears, where 16% of the workforce were African American, 54% of those who lost jobs at Sears were African American because Sears closed jobs from the areas in the cities where African Americans were located. Or Coca-Cola, where 18% of the workforce were African American, 42% of people who lost jobs because they reduced jobs in the areas where African Americans were concentrated. So again, it's a dramatic example of how normal corporate policy can have adverse negative effects. Moving along quickly. The point I am making is place is a powerful predictor of health. This is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Commission to Build a Healthy America, where we characterize healthy and unhealthy communities on multiple dimensions in terms of safety of neighborhood environment, the air and the physical environment, access to parks, access to high-quality housing, access to good nutrition, the cleanliness of streets, access to primary care. So on multiple dimensions, where you live is a powerful determinant of health. One of the disturbing trends, if we look at data on segregation, is the increasing segregation of Latinos in the United States, which does not portend well, especially for U.S.-born Latinos and what the future will look for them. This is work I did with Dolores Acevedo Garcia, where we looked at the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States where kids are being raised, and we asked the question, what percentage of Black and Latino kids are doing more poorly than the worst of white kids? We look at the white kids who were doing the worst, and we use that as a standard of comparison. And we found that in the U.S., 76% of all African-American kids and 69% of all Latino kids were doing more poorly than the worst of white kids. And then we said, well, let's look in the more segregated areas. In the more segregated areas, it's even much higher and much worse. So it's a dramatic example of what's happening in the United States. This is just to put the U.S. into context. This is the level of segregation in the year 1991. Nelson Mandela was still in jail in South Africa. 90%, a score of 90 meant that 90% of Black South Africans would have to move in order to have an even distribution of Blacks and whites in South Africa under legally mandated apartheid. In the United States, in the 2000 census, many of America's largest cities like Detroit, Milwaukee, New York, Chicago, Newark, Cleveland have levels of segregation that are only slightly lower than that under legally mandated apartheid. So just illustrating how a big challenge we have. What can we do about all these problems? We need to move upstream. We need to focus on non-medical determinants. We need to focus on place-based solutions. What the evidence is very clear is that the social environment where we live, learn, work, play, and worship are the forces that determine our opportunities and chances to be healthy. And one of our big challenges, as you're doing, talking about health in all policies, we need to redefine health policy, and that health policy is not just the work of the public health department, but policies or the medical sector, but in all sectors of society that have health consequences. So the best way to improve America's health and reduce our medical bills would be to invest in our schools, our sidewalks, produce markets, preschool programs, parks, jobs, housing, transportation are examples of the kinds of things we need to do. Now, someone says, do we have a shred of evidence that if we do this, that this would work and we can do it? Well, in the 1990s, the Department of Housing and Urban Development implemented 3 programs. One called Moving to Opportunity that took poor families and looked to see what would happen if all we did for them was change their neighborhood, move them to less poor neighborhoods. Another one was called Jobs Plus. What if we saturated poor areas with employment services and rent-based financial incentives? And the third was Bridges to Work. There are jobs in the suburbs and there are poor people in the inner city who don't have access to the suburbs. If we can build those linkages, will people take those jobs? Will it work? And here is a review from the Urban Institute that's showing that these programs documented that interventions can increase income, improve safety and security, and improve physical and mental health. If you make the opportunities available, families will respond. Meaningful change, though, requires sustained effort over time. You can't do it as a 2-year program and think you've solved the problem. People need help in finding jobs, but also in keeping jobs. So you have to address issues of retention, advancement, commuting costs. And programs also need to tackle all the major barriers simultaneously. People don't have their lives compartmentalized, so you can't just address the housing problem and leave the safety and health and employment and education problems unaddressed. You need to do them together. But will this have any impact on health? The best evidence comes from the Moving to Opportunity program, where these persons in public housing projects, all that was done was change their neighborhood. They weren't moved to great neighborhoods, they were moved to less poor neighborhoods than their current neighborhoods. 10 to 15 years later, a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine shows they have lower levels of obesity, lower levels of severe obesity, and lower levels of diabetes risk. All that was done for them, no medical intervention, no health education classes, all you did was change the neighborhood. And 15 years later, their health is better. Randomized, controlled trial, high quality scientific evidence. The Yonkers Housing Intervention, another intervention that did the same thing, randomized people. 2 years later, those who moved, better overall health, less substance abuse, less neighborhood disorder, less violence in those who stayed, greater satisfaction with public transportation, higher rates of employment, lower levels of welfare use. So again, dramatic benefits on health and socioeconomic status simply by moving them. So clearly, I think these are good models that provide us high-quality scientific information. I don't think they are the solution for a national program. You shouldn't have to move from your neighborhood to live in a better neighborhood. So the challenge is, what can we do to invest in neighborhoods to improve outcomes in the places where people live? We know from qualitative research from the Moving to Opportunity program, many people who moved back. And the biggest reason why they moved back is their social networks were disrupted. You'd moved them to a better neighborhood and they loved it, but they no longer had the social networks and the friends that they had enjoyed. There's a lot of work suggesting, here's a study from Denmark, green areas. Just people who live in places where they have access to green areas, lower levels of stress and lower rates of obesity even seem to be unrelated to how much time they spend outdoors in the green areas. Evidence from work by study done that simply each additional hour spent in driving is associated with a 6% increase in obesity. Each kilometer walked per day is associated with a 5% reduction in obesity. Here's another example of how the environment affects our health. The 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta. Residents in Atlanta, because of the games, were encouraged to reduce driving to avoid downtown congestion. Peak traffic volumes in Atlanta decreased by 23%. Emergency room visits during the Olympics declined by 44%. But as soon as the Olympics were over and we resumed our love affair with the automobile, levels returned to normal. Other quick examples, transportation policies, public health policy. I'm going to move quickly. These are factors that affect walking, good infrastructure, nearby destinations, greenery, all factors that encourage people to walk. There's a national movement called Leave No Child Inside that is trying to encourage us to connect our kids with outdoors and reap the benefits for their physical and mental health from doing that. There's evidence that shows the neighborhood environment and characteristics of the environment predicts obesity rates, especially for girls in the United States. And just the environmental conditions and the access to sidewalks and parks and recreation centers and libraries, those are predictors at a community level of obesity levels. Purpose-built communities, the last example I want to give on the front of neighborhood environments. This is a dramatic example. The East Lake District in Atlanta was one of the worst off communities in the greater Atlanta area. And a group of community activists came together with some wealthy philanthropists, and they decided that they would work on the problems of urban blight and poverty and failing schools and crime and unemployment together. They committed, we're not taking a piecemeal approach. We want to work on these issues together. And what have been the results? A 95% reduction in crime since the launch of the purpose-built community. Employment rate of low-income residents in that community has increased from 13% to 70%. East Lake students at above the grade level functioning when the program started was at 5%. It's now at 96%. And this model is being replicated in multiple parts of the United States. A dramatic example, it takes investment of resources, it takes commitment, and it takes cross-sector collaboration. But the point is, we actually know what to do, and we know that it works. We also need to improve economic well-being. There's a lot of evidence that simply by improving economic status leads to improvements in health with no health intervention. The Center for American Progress has laid out a plan of how we can reduce poverty in half in the United States with 10 years. But I want to point out we have good, high-quality scientific evidence that simply giving poor people money leads to improved health. There's studies of the earned income tax credit that show that by economists and sociologists. There's studies that have shown every increase in the implementation of the Social Security program, and every time the index of the Social Security program has increased, there has been improvements in the health of the elderly. There's the Great Smoky Mountain study in North Carolina, which was a study that Costello and her colleagues were following over time, a cohort of individuals in North Carolina. About half of the sample were Native Americans. A Native American casino opened on a Native American reservation, and these households then got an additional money. They've looked to see what has happened to those Native American households as a result of additional money. For the adolescents, declining rates of deviant and aggressive behavior that existed among them persisted when they became adults and established households on their own. They eliminated the American Indian white gap in high school graduation rate and in criminal offenses for those households that got money. Simply giving households additional money, dramatic improvements. We have international evidence from what I call conditional cash transfer programs, studies sponsored by the World Bank. Mexico, the Oportunidades program in Mexico is an example of it, and is the one that is most widely talked about, that shows given, by the way, not poor people money, given poor women money leads to improvements in health for their entire households. We also have dramatic examples of US data. In the last 60 years, has there been a window of time when we have reduced the black-white gap in health? Yes. When? Between mid-1960s and mid-1970s. Exactly the period of time that corresponded to reductions in the black-white gap in income as a result of the civil rights policies and the war on poverty. We have improvement in the health of African Americans. That's documented in the work of George Kaplan, the work of Richard Cooper, and others have shown during 68 to 78, for example, Richard Cooper shows African Americans had more rapid improvements in their health compared to that of whites. That's looking at national data on overall mortality and life expectancy. And what happened after that? This is the income level of blacks and whites in 1978. African Americans earned 59 cents for every dollar whites earned. This is the era of Reaganomics. And you could see throughout the decade of the 80s, blacks' income worsened and fell from the 1978 level to as much as 55 cents in 1982. And it wasn't until 1994 that blacks got back up above where they were in 1978. What happened to the health of African Americans in the decade of the 80s? This is data from the National Center for Health Statistics. You see life expectancy for whites increasing just very slightly throughout the decade of the 1980s. But here's the life expectancy of African Americans in 1984. For 5 years in a row, the life expectancy of African Americans declined from the 1984 level. So exactly the period of time when we had worsening an income gap between the races, we have an absolute decline in health for African Americans during this period of time. Let me talk briefly about family structure and the potential impact that family structure can have. It's a driver of poor outcomes for kids. There are exceptions, but on average, kids raised by a single parent do much worse in terms of growing up in poverty, dropping out of high school. Many persons think of the determinants of family structure linked to underlying family values. But we have a lot of scientific evidence suggests they are importantly driven, and this may not even be politically correct to say, but that's what the evidence says, by economic opportunities for males. So in the United States, when male employment increases, marriage rates decline. When average male earnings increase, marriage rates increase. So you can predict rates of marriage in this country for blacks and whites just looking at opportunities for males. And there's evidence of Robert Sampson that I'm not going to go into, where it is the opportunities for employment opportunities at the neighborhood level that predicts higher rates of violent crime in the United States. And importantly, Robert Sampson and William Julius Wilson concluded that the sources of violent crime are remarkably invariant across race and rooted instead in the structural differences among communities, cities, and states in economic and family organization. Importantly, they said, in the 171 largest cities in the U.S., there's not even one city where whites live under similar conditions to blacks. And they concluded that the worst urban context in which whites reside is considerably better than the average context of black communities. Can we do anything about this strong relationship between family structure and economic opportunity? Look, bear with me for a second here. Here is data from UNICEF. This is the rate of children in single-parent households in the U.S., 19% of all children. And we see in the U.S., 55% of all children in single-parent households are living in poverty, compared to 16% of children in other household structures. In Sweden, 21% of all children are in single-parent households, but only 7% of children in single-parent households are living in poverty. Why does that happen? Look at data again from the UNICEF report. This is the rate of child poverty in Sweden before taxes and transfers. Taxes and transfers reflect social policy. It reflects decisions we make as a society. This is what happens to the child poverty rate in Sweden after taxes and transfers. It drops from 23.4% to 2.6%. In the US, after taxes and transfers, child poverty rates drop from 26.7% to 22.4%. In other words, we are making policy decisions in the United States that are not benefiting our children in breaking the link with poverty. We have striking evidence. I talked about the Abecedarian Project. We also have striking evidence from the Perry Preschool Project. Again, poor kids in Ypsilanti, Michigan were randomized as preschoolers to an early childhood intervention program. They've now been followed to age 40. What is the difference? Again, we have a control group and an intervention group. Those who received the program, higher levels of education, higher levels of employment, income, savings, marriage, home ownership. Fewer arrests for violent and property crimes, less involvement with the welfare system, and for every $1 invested is a $17 return to society. If any of you know of a place where I can invest $1 and get a $17 return before I leave today, please, I would like to know where that is. I want to conclude by sharing with you an example of what we need in the United States. We need people with a vision who will give the American innovation that we have a chance and apply it to some of the challenges we face. So I want to tell you about an angel that I met in the state of Pennsylvania. His name is Jeffrey Brown, and this is Mr. Jeffrey Brown here. And as part of my work with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Commission to Build a Healthy America, we went to the state of Pennsylvania, to the city of Philadelphia, because the state of Pennsylvania has done some of the most innovative work on addressing food deserts in the United States. They have the Food Trust and the Food Financing Initiative. And as a result of investing $30 million over 3 years, that the Food Financing Initiative has leveraged into $200 million with private finance. And so there's a public-private partnership. And we visited one of the supermarkets that Mr. Brown has opened. He owns 10 ShopRite supermarkets, but he's opened one in a poor African-American community that had been without a supermarket for 30 years. And what I want to illustrate He's a businessman and he's making money. But how he has been able to build within this supermarket a concern for the community and meeting the needs of the community. First of all, he told me most of his stores are in the suburbs, but he committed to 2 stores in the inner city areas, same price in all stores, same hours in all stores. The stores in the inner city community have a community room, a well-equipped conference room that is available free to any group in the community who wants to have a meeting. All they have to do is come in and make a reservation. And we had a meeting in the community room with community leaders, and they said, you know what? Mr. Brown not only makes the room available for us, but when we come in for a meeting, he has refreshments in the store for us. What else does he do? Customized service to the needs of the community. I walked into the store with Mr. Brown and he showed me that the deli, there was a regular deli, and he said this is the halal approved deli for the Muslim community, different equipment so it meets their needs. I walked around the corner, I saw a section on African movies. I walked another aisle, I saw the Caribbean food section, and then I saw an African food section. And I turned to Mr. Brown and I said, oh, he also showed me there was a halal-approved cosmetics, an entire aisle of halal-approved cosmetics. And I turned to Mr. Brown and I said, what kind of consumer research did you do to so tailor the store to the needs of the community? He says, I didn't do any of the traditional consumer research. It would have been a waste of time. So what did you do? He said, I worked with local community leaders and local clergy, and I asked them to nominate people in the community that I could go to their homes and have dinner with them. He said, I went to their homes and had dinner with them. I was very observant, and I asked a lot of questions. And he has completely tailored a store to the community. An example, every manager of a department in his supermarket has to serve as part of being a manager on a local community board. So his store is tied into the needs of the community. He told me he wants the place to be a place that's welcoming, it's large and free. It has to be clean, but he also wants to respect community members. So I don't know if they do this in California, but I know they do it in New York City, that you go to a supermarket in a poor neighborhood and you can only get the supermarket cart 10 feet out of the store. There's some big pillars that block you from pushing the cart further. He said he didn't want to do that. But he still wants to keep his carts. So what he did was he built an electronic fence. It's invisible, but there's an electronic fence on the end of the parking lot, so that if you try to push the supermarket cart off the parking lot, the wheels lock. So you can't take it off the parking lot, but there aren't the barriers that he finds dehumanizing to individuals. He supports entrepreneurship with local minority businesses, and he point out products that he says he's buying from a local entrepreneur. Impressively, 40 of his 280 employees are ex-offenders, persons with a criminal record. He works with 2 community groups to provide additional training for them so that they can now have the work ethic to work successfully in his stores. In fact, he told me the reason he needs help from the Food Financing Initiative is that his training costs are higher in his inner city supermarket. And I said, I don't understand. Why are your training costs high? He said, yes, they're 2 to 3 times as high. He said, well, people from the community, he's hiring a lot of people from the community, he says they operate according to the law of the street. The law of the street is, if you're nice to me, I'll be nice back to you. If you're mean to me, I'll be mean back to you. And so he says he actually has to spend more time with his employees to help them to realize, even if this person is rude and is completely unreasonable and have accused you falsely of something you haven't done, you still have to smile because the customer is always right. So he spends more time working with them, but once trained, the retention rates are higher than his suburban supermarkets. And finally, just another example, he runs a Gifts for Guns program. Every quarter, they offer an opportunity for residents of the community to hand in guns off the street. And for every gun handed in, you get a $100 certificate to use for goods in the supermarket. And every time he does this, they pick up 400 guns off the street. What he finds, no higher levels of shrinkage in inner city supermarkets. That means no higher level of theft. Higher training costs, but low turnover. Same volume of fruit and vegetable sales. This is for my economist friends who say the fact that supermarkets don't exist, there isn't a demand. When you make it available, people use it. Higher poultry and fish sales. And the supermarket is an engine of economic investment. Property values increase when they open a large 65,000 square foot store. It stimulates other retail shopping. Seniors can walk to the store. I met seniors who walked to the store. They were interested in these men in suits walking around the store, who we were. And one lady told me, I come and walk to the store every day. It's just a wonderful place. But he also has the store as a community center. There's space for WIC and CHIP and food stamps, SNAP, to have booths that they can meet the needs of community. And he told me the keys to success is show respect, treat all with dignity, good shopping experience, customized service, community responsibility, making it affordable, listening to and working with the community. He said to me, a cookie-cutter approach of opening a supermarket will not work. You've got to work with the community, respect the community, and build with the community. The point is, we can address inequalities. It's about all of us. The health of America depends on the health of all Americans. And when people get sick, it hurts our productivity as a nation. Improving America's health will not only improve health, but improve the quality of lives of all of us. As I conclude, I want to mention a couple resources. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Commission to Build a Healthy America. We issued a report in 2008, another one in January of this year. It's available on rwjf.org. It's entitled A Time to Act, Investing in the Health of Our Children and Our Communities. It has 3 recommendations: make and invest in America's youngest children a priority, integrate health into community development, and build more health into healthcare. County health rankings, you're aware of them. Someone mentioned them before. It's a wonderful resource that looks the ranking of health in every county, in every state, and also points to the things that you can do. It's a resource of finding within each domain that affects health the latest research evidence of what you can do to have interventions. Unnatural causes is still a wonderful resource to use at the community level to help improve health. So inequalities in health are not acts of God. They're not accidents. They reflect the implementation of social policy, and we need opportunities for health and barriers to healthy choices are shaped by neighborhood and contextual factors. We need new place-based initiatives to make healthy choices easier in the built environment, but our greatest need is for political will and a new commitment to use the current knowledge we have to improve health. I leave you with the words of Edmund Burke, the Irish philosopher. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men and women to do nothing. I believe we are good people. It is my hope and prayer that we will leave this place with a renewed commitment to go out and make a difference in investing in improving the quality of lives of our communities so that we can give every American child that which they should be entitled to. Thank you very much.
You know, we started out by saying that Dr. Williams was a rock star, and I think that he has proven that to be exactly the case. He's also agreed to take some questions, which we're going to do next. But I'll say before he does that when you look at what Sierra Health is doing, the work that Robert Phillips was reading around our zip codes, the 15 zip codes we've adopted as part of our Community Transformation Grants program, the clinical initiative that's being led by Kaing that's targeting underserved, medically underserved communities, the responsive grants programs that are going in specific communities as well as our San Joaquin Valley work, again, acknowledging our colleagues in Merced. This is precisely why, and we've got a lot of questions about this, why our approach has actually been much more targeted and tailored to what we do. The last thing I'll say about this for the foundation is that of the health foundations in America, and there are many partners that we've been working with, there are 220 health conversion foundations in America now. Many of them are not as large as some of the big private health foundations, but we are many. And one of the calls that we believe is really important to be made nationally is for regional foundations such as Sierra Health to really become active in this particular arena of work. We think we're an underutilized resource in many, many respects for this important endeavor. And with that, I will open it up for questions for Dr. Williams. Yes.
League of Women Voters. Thanks. Asking one favor. I don't know if this is on. Is this on?
Okay. Dr. Williams, you went very quickly through your presentation, faster than I could take notes. I'm wondering if you would be kind enough to post your presentation with the citations that I'm looking for on the Sierra Health Foundation website.
The answer is yes.
Thank you.
Yes, question on this side.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was wonderful. As somebody on the front lines, we've had years in low-income neighborhoods where we've had a lot of passion and good people in the low-income neighborhoods partner with us and then have things fall through. The grant ends. The money is lost. It's gone before lots of change can be made. How do we... And now some of the neighborhood folks won't work with us anymore. They won't even take surveys because they're feeling used in a certain way. How do we keep that energy going at the local level when all these policy changes keep coming and going and things change without much change in the neighborhoods?
That's a very good question, and it is a challenge. I think what is really important is two things. One is to work collaboratively with neighborhoods. I certainly come from the school of thought that I'm not an expert in community-based participatory research, but I have great colleagues and mentors who have done that work. And currently I'm working with a colleague. We're working in Lawrence, Massachusetts. It's the poorest city in the state of Massachusetts, using a community-based participatory research. It's 60% Latino as well. And what we find, my colleague, Dr. Vishwanath, who is leading the project that I'm involved with in Lawrence, I mean, there's sometimes opportunities for grants that come through, and we decline going after the grant because if we got the grant, there wouldn't be enough resources where we could provide resources for our community partners as well. So that we look to see what resources we will need to do the research, but also we have to give something to the community. They can't work for free. And I think they appreciate the transparency and they appreciate the communication so that they understand where we are. I mean, people perceive us as Harvard. It's a very wealthy university, so therefore you have all of these resources, and which is not exact. It is a wealthy university. We don't have all the resources. But so I think what we found that works with working with communities is honest communication, number one, but also importantly working with them as partners. And if there's honesty, communication, and transparency, they understand some of the challenges and will continue to work with us through good times and bad. So I think it's making them aware of it and trying to equitably share the resources and look not only at what it will take for, I'm speaking as a researcher, for us to do the research, but realizing that we have to give something back and they need to be compensated for their time and their energy and efforts as well. Another question?
I was wondering if you have presented this information to groups that might not use the social determinants of health or health equity lens. How has this information been received? Because I imagine most people in this room might be exposed to this language, understand it, are starting to see the data and want to do more. But what about those individuals who might be more of the resistors? How do you recommend presenting this kind of information to those folks?
That's really a great question. So let me tell you about our experience with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Commission to Build a Healthy America. When we started in 2007, we actually commissioned communications experts to do research for us. We also commissioned qualitative research to be done on the Hill with the top Democratic and Republican policymakers on the House and Senate side, as well as in the administration. And by the way, on the Vulnerable Populations website, there is on the RWJ Foundation, there is a resource on, I think it's, the title is something like Talking About the Social Determinants of Health or something like that, communicating about the social determinants. That is a useful resource. And I would also, talking about resources, on the Frameworks Institute website, there's also what do they call it, an issue brief. It's hard to find, but it's on there, on the resources on talking about race or talking about disparities, racial disparities, that are very useful, I think, that gives us the findings of research. One of the things we found was that none of the policymakers we talked about knew what the social determinants of health meant, that phrase. And if you look at the Commission's work, we don't really use the social determinants of health phrase at all. We talk about where you live, learn, work, and play, and how that impacts your health and how that's more important than doctor. So that was our translation of the social determinants of health. People understand where you live, learn, work, and play. And I would say that people, lay people, entities across different groups, I've certainly spoken to many, they respond positively, and it resonates with them when you give them examples and they understand of how health is shaped by the opportunities to be healthy in places where you spend most of your time. I'll tell you an interesting story. On the day of the afternoon of President Obama's inauguration, first inauguration, and the next day, while my wife and daughters were in Washington, D.C., I was out in Appalachia with former Senator Frist. He was one of the commissioners on our commission, because that was a date that had worked for him, his staff had picked, and I hadn't realized it was the inauguration day. I wouldn't have been there if I had realized that, but I was committed to doing it, and we were traveling from community to community in Appalachia with Senator Frist, talking about the social determinants of health, of where you live, learn, work, and play, getting positive responses everywhere we go. So even in poor places like Appalachia or among policymakers, I find it resonates to people. But I think we need to do more than we typically do in terms of what language we use, and how we tell the story. I think that's what's important. And I mentioned some resources that can help along those lines. Yes.
We have a question from Merced. Steve Roussos with the UC Merced Bloom Center for Developing Economies. You've shown us so well the research that describes the problems and that can even guide many solutions. Clearly research has been done and there's more research to do, yet the speed and scale at which research is translated into action for communities are not matching the scale and urgency of the problems in our communities. First question is, how can our nation become faster and better at building the skills of researchers and community members to collaborate on later stage translational research to implement evidence-based public health and prevention practices that our communities can use? And I'll hold off on the second one.
Yeah, so I mean, I say this to my students. I think we do want to generate the best research, and we want to have the best science available. But we also should not be naive. Most policy is made in the absence of research. I mean, if you've worked in the policy world, it's not, people don't do things because the latest research. Sometimes a good story or people's hunches are much more important than any research findings. So, I mean, it is really great when the research comes to the fore at a moment that's ripe and it drives policy. And I think we always want to have the research available for that. But we shouldn't fool ourselves that it's research drives policy routinely. So then we need to think of what drives policy. And one of the biggest challenges I think we face is, how do we tell the story of disparities in a way that connects emotionally with individuals? Americans are a generous people. You see the outpouring of generosity and support when there is a crisis halfway around the world, and people see the pictures on television, and people give generously, because I think we are a kind, generous people. But why did they do it? Because they were tugged at emotionally. And one of the challenges we face in the disparities area, I've actually written about this, not that I have all of the solutions. But I'll tell you what I think we need as solutions, and it's different than how I have thought during my career, is that to be successful in addressing disparities, we need to do a lot more collaboration with political scientists, and we need a lot more collaboration with communication experts. Because the challenge is, how do we tell the story in a way that that connects with people emotionally, because we vote and we act based on our hearts and not our minds. There's a lot of scientific research that shows that if I connect with the issue emotionally, you will be motivated to do it. And that is the challenge. And if you read the Frameworks Institute website, it's a challenge because issues of race and poverty bring certain frames that makes it even much more difficult for people to connect them. There's some barriers that block that. But I think we need to be more effective and be more dedicated to invest in the resources to do that. So yes, we need all the research we can get, but I think it's not just about research. The other point is, we need, I'll tell you an experience I had that has shaped me. This is about 2 years ago. I was sitting at a breakfast in Washington, D.C., honoring the sociologist who is the head of the National Science Foundation's Social and Behavioral Sciences. And he got up and spoke to us there, and he said that there are other sociologists from around the country who are sending him notes and snippets of studies saying, this is your next congressional hearing you have to go to, here is evidence. He says, I do not need any more evidence. Please don't send me things to use. I have all that I need. He said the single most important thing you can do to help, and he surprised me with what he said. He said, look at some of your brightest students and encourage them to run for political office. He said, in Congress today, in the House and Senate, there isn't a single sociologist. He says one of the biggest things that is hurting research on disparities and social behavioral sciences more broadly is that the historic champions for research in the Congress have either retired or died. And there aren't people sitting there making decisions who have an appreciation of the potential contribution. And I have started to do that, to look at my classes and tell people about the importance of running for political office, because becoming engaged. Spent a lot of time on the Hill. Every office on the Hill has people who are there, staff answering the phone calls and keeping account of what is the constituency calling in about what. So we've got to be active. We've got to be mobilized. Don't take this the wrong way. I have also said we need to learn a lesson from the Tea Party. If you actually look at the Tea Party, I'm not talking about the politics of the Tea Party, but look at the size of the Tea Party. It's really not that many people. But what have they done? Very brilliantly, they have used the existing political system to push their agenda. There are enough people on the other side who have feelings, but we are disorganized, in disarray, not using the existing political system to advance the agenda we believe in. So we live in a democracy. We need to maximize the opportunities to organize and to let our voice be heard on the issues that are important. And I think there are disparities in power, there are entrenched economic interests, I'm not denying all of that, but I'm saying there's a lot more that we can do if we get organized and mobilized to do it. There was a second part to that question.
There appears to be a growing belief that technology and maybe apps will solve many of our problems. This may be true, but is not clear that the distribution of technological advances are also advancing equity. How can the level of investment in research to improve science and technology for biomedical research and technological innovation be increased to benefit social and community innovations related to equity?
Wow, these are really big questions. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can fully answer the question, but to answer, yes, there is a gap. Just as we talked about socioeconomic status determines the distribution of resources within society. So yes, there are gaps, and they're real, and that we need to take what steps we can to address the gaps in access to technology. I certainly think within the area of disparities in every other area, we need to maximize the opportunities to use technology. I also don't think technology is a magic bullet. Now, my daughters think I'm really technologically challenged. I don't think I'm as bad as they think I am, but you know, so I think there are opportunities there that we want to take advantage of, but I also don't think it's a magic bullet that solves all the problems. Yes.
Hi, good morning, and thank you again for coming. This is an issue that I've always felt existed, and I'm just so glad that we're having discussion. I still, and I know a lot of people in here, I grew up in Del Paso Heights, And my husband and I still live there now, and we are definitely in that top of the 5 zip codes with tremendous health disparities. And so many people have touched on it, but first of all, people need to trust the folks that are coming into the community. I was just working with my church group this past week, and I was there for 3 days, and the discussions are always going back to Tuskegee. The discussions are always going back to perception of what people think of us. People will give if they truly believe that there is a need to give, but there are still perceptions of we're lazy, we're fat because we don't work hard, we're fat because we don't eat well. Still not understanding that social aspect of it, and it's critical, even as healthcare providers, that when we come into the communities, because I'm already in the community, that we look at these folks as human beings that have a strong desire to want to be better, to want to live better, no differently than anybody else. But it starts with perception because it's reality to a lot of people. And so a lot of my people in my healthcare group, or actually at my church, said to me, their healthcare providers don't even offer them the diet and exercise. They just give them the meds without having discussion of understanding, oh, I've got diabetes, but I don't understand it. There's perception even within the healthcare field that folks in these areas are sick because that's their choice. We have to make that change, and so I thank you and I applaud you for what you do. And with what Jahmal said, we have to have the courage to go out one by one, even if it takes that, to help the people who are so desperately wanting to help.
Let me just, I could talk about answer this question with an hour talk, but I won't. Because the issue you raise is a really important one that I haven't addressed in this talk. There's a lot of evidence of the persistence of negative stereotypes. There's a lot of evidence of what we call implicit biases. There's a lot of evidence that people who hold negative racial, ethnic stereotypes, which are the strongest stereotype, is the negative stereotypes of blacks in the U.S. from the research study. All minority groups are negatively stereotyped, but blacks are stereotyped more negatively than any other. And we have a lot of research evidence indicating that the activation of these negative stereotypes is automatic and unconscious. That if you hold a negative stereotype of a group based on your socialization, and I have data that shows what the studies have done, look what stereotypes co-occur in American culture. People who hold the stereotypes are not bad people. You're just normal Americans because that's what you're reflecting what you have been fed. And that these stereotypes are activated automatically and unconsciously, and they shape your behavior. You discriminate against someone without any intent on your part, and it occurs even among people who are not prejudiced. So really raising awareness levels of implicit biases. If you want to read about this, Mazahin Banaji is a psychologist at my university that has co-authored a book called Blind Spot. Blind Spot is a title of a book on implicit biases that I think it's worth anyone who deals with others to read. It's also another resource would be the implicit, if you Google the implicit association test. Banaji also maintains the implicit association test. It's the most widely used test in the world to assess implicit biases. And what the research finds is that all Americans, 70 to 80% of all Americans have implicit biases, negative biases of African Americans. 70 to 80%. The only group that differs from that 70 to 80% is African Americans, where among African Americans, about a third of African Americans have implicit biases against African Americans. 1/3. But for the rest of the population, for any subgroups, for physicians, for lawyers, for whites, for Asians, it doesn't matter the subgroup, it's everybody else is between the 70 to 80% range. So it's normal, and it's normal because that's what you have been fed. You only reflecting what you've fed. So it's a huge problem that you have raised, and we certainly have to address that, and we certainly need to be, I tell my students, I am a prejudiced person because I'm a normal person. All of us, all human beings, process the complex cognitive information we face every day by putting things into categories. And based on the society in which we were raised, in every society there are in-groups and out-groups. And what the research shows, that if you meet someone from a category that is an out-group, that you hold negative implicit biases from, you will treat that person differently. That means you'll discriminate against them. And most Americans have negative implicit biases of blacks. But it's not just about race. And it's not just about American society. It's not about white people. It's about how all human beings process information. If you have negative implicit biases about fat people, about gay people, about old people, about women, you will treat anyone who you recognize from that group, and it happens in a split second without your conscious awareness. You will treat that person differently. So yes, it's a huge problem, and those of us who work with individuals need to understand this is a normal human process, and address it. And we also need, I think the other point I would make of your question about working with community, it illustrates, which is difficult. I have gone into communities to work and been told the white people have gotten smart and they've sent a black man in this time. So I've been told that to my face, working with communities. So, but I think, but even that community was a study of the clergy in New Haven, Connecticut many years ago, early in my career. And myself and an African-American psychiatrist, we were both doing this study of the clergy, and that's what we were told. We were successful in completing the study because it takes patience, it takes time. You don't walk out the door when people say something outrageous that's not true. You work with them and you build trust. Building trust, especially for communities that have been abused and taken advantage of. I learned a term in South Africa. I did a large national study in South Africa. And when one of my first visits to South Africa was meeting with community groups as we were preparing to talk to people to develop the measures that we wanted to develop for the study, someone raised their hands and asked me, is this going to be a briefcase study? Now, I'd never heard the term before. So I said, what is a briefcase study? He said, a briefcase study is when you come, you collect the information from us, you put it in your briefcase, you close your briefcase, and we never see you again. And you have to realize that people have encountered that before, and it takes a while to build trust and let them realize that you are here to stay and that you are truly committed and are willing to work with them. So it's a process of trust, and that takes time and so forth. We probably have one last question. I'm not sure who's watching the time, but yes.
So oftentimes, we don't hear, we in the room, like, we know that this work is the right thing to do, but particularly for opponents of this work, how can you speak to this need to really prioritize health equity issues with respect to the economic and domestic security of our country, and particularly within our state? We have over 60 countries represented, over 200 languages. Literally, the demographic shift is the browning and the tanning effect of America in our state. So to kind of try to bring, the opponents of this work along, what's that argument economically and domestically about the security of our country and state?
That's a really, really great question. So I would say that when I talk about that, so I was just in Louisville, Kentucky, speaking at the Muhammad Ali Center recently on the business case for racial equity. So briefly, what is the business case for racial equity? First of all, there's research by the two economists who served in the President's Council of Economic Advisors, published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, that shows it's part of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Commission's first report, but it's also a published peer-reviewed scientific paper that shows that the gaps in health by education is costing the U.S. economy $1 trillion a year. If all Americans had the health of the college-educated in the U.S., remember the college-educated don't even have the best level of health, but if all Americans got there, the U.S. economy would save $1 trillion a year. So that's one statistic. So importantly then, the problem of inequalities in health and the problems of the higher levels of illness and disability is hurting our productivity as a nation and hurting our global competitiveness. So that's the first point. On racial and ethnic inequality specifically, Tom Leviste and Daryl Gaskin from Johns Hopkins have done it in a joint center report, but it's also a published paper that shows racial ethnic inequalities in health in the U.S. cost the U.S. economy $312 billion a year is the cost of racial inequalities. And some of that is the added cost of medical treatment, but the bigger portion is the lost productivity cost. So first of all, it is economically costly. Secondly, and more powerfully, is the demographic shift. If people really understand the seismic demographic shifts that we are facing in the United States, we would wake up and think about issues differently. So let me tell you the demographic story really quickly. In 2012, for the first time, the majority of babies born in the United States were non-white. By 2018, it is estimated that a majority of persons under age 18 in the United States will be non-white. By 2042, the census predicts that a majority of adults in the United States will be non-white. So fast forward to 2060, or we could pick 2050. In 2050, the majority of elderly persons over age 65 in the U.S. will be white. For every person receiving Social Security benefits, there'll be 2 employees. One of the 2 employees will be black or Latino. If you are interested in the quality of life during retirement, if you are interested in ensuring that we have an economic system that will take care of you in your twilight days, it makes a whole lot of sense to ensure that the black, Latino, Native American, Asian American kids today are prepared to be productive, to be contributors to the economy, to be successful economically, because they will be the ones paying into the Social Security system when you will be drawing benefits. So, I mean, I think that is the clearest example of, as we look to the future and we look at the demographic shifts that are taken, ensuring that today's youth are economically successful is ensuring my own future and the future of all of us. So that's kind of, for me, the most powerful economic case. And, you know, the Policy Link, Angela Glover Blackwell's group, they have written a lot on this topic in terms of what can be done. She was also one of our commissioners in the RWJ Commission, wonderful resource. But yes, thank you so much.
One last round of applause. As I said when we started today, that the speaker series will continue, so keep an eye out for who and what will be up next. One thing I will say is that in September, we are working to bring the Federal Reserve Summit here to talk about community development and its relationship to health equity and health equality as well. So keep your eyes open and your ears open, and we'll be talking about that more as that date approaches. Thank you all for joining us. Hopefully you found it provocative, informative, and are prepared to go out and have great impact in your communities. Thanks.